much about the Cistercian way that appeals to me personally, but three things in particular. Being circular in nature, it reminds me of something pilgrimage has taught me, about which T.S. Eliot so eloquently writes: to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. It probably takes roughly the same time to walk the whole length of the Cistercian Way as it would take to walk the Camino Frances, the most popular pilgrim route to Santiago de Compostela through Spain. And then lastly, of course, not forgetting, I can actually see the Cistercian Way path from my garden, stretching out 200 yards away from my front door. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Maddie Gray to share the Cistercian Way with us here tonight, its founding and early development, how it continues to evolve, potential projects in the pipeline, and some thoughts on how we might individually support and promote the Cistercian Way itself. Maddie, croeso and welcome.
Diolch, diolch. Thank you very much indeed for the warm welcome. I'm going to now share my screen and attempt to find the button that says, there we are, slideshow. Slideshow from beginning. Move that up. Right. So, thank you very much for that very warm welcome, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you. When Jonathan and I were planning this lecture, he did mention to me the fact that you've been thinking of providing routes in the British Isles that people could walk part of the Camino and then finish it off in Spain. And he mentioned the idea of a Camino Inglés. So of course I said, well, why not a Camino Galés? A Camino Cymraeg, as we would say. And ironically, there is a project of that sort. Actually, well, we were thinking about it before the pandemic, which will build on part of the Cistercian Way route, which is something I want to explore with you as part of this lecture. So, as Jonathan says, I want to talk a bit about the Cistercian Way project. I want to talk about a bit of background on the Cistercians. Who were they? Why were they so important in Wales? I want to look at some of the things that we've discovered in the process of researching the route, to look at some of the places that the route takes you to. And I want to look at future developments, including, as I say, the possibility of a Camino Cymraeg going across South Wales to St David's. So, first of all, why the Cistercians? And why can I not get my, won't this move down? Sorry, we seem to be having a few problems here. Get rid of that. Right, are you still hearing me? Jonathan? Yes, right, okay. Yes. I'm having difficulty. Yes, there we are, it's working. Okay. Zoom is still a bit new to me. So first of all, why the Cistercians? The thing is that they were hugely important in Welsh history. For some reason, and we don't really know why, the Cistercians were the order of choice in medieval Wales. The early Norman martial lords, yes, they founded a few little Benedictine priories, but once they really got themselves into Wales, they started founding Cistercian abbeys. And the Welsh lords and the Welsh kings also, what they wanted to do was found Cistercian abbeys. So there are, well, as you can see from this map, 15 of them dotted all around Wales. plus a couple of short-lived foundations that didn't really take off, one of which we do actually visit in the course of the Cistercian Way, this here at Penrhys up in the Rhondda, partly because it's a place so dear to my own heart. And so if you join the dots of all the Cistercian foundations in Wales, you pretty much walk around the country. You don't get right out to St David's, you don't get right out to Aberdown and Bardsey, but there are other routes that will take you there. So it seemed like a lovely way of exploring Wales, the landscape, the history in all its variety. How it all began, it was never actually meant to be a permanent long distance footpath. It was meant to be a one-off. Because the Cistercians were so important in Welsh history, in 1998, when we were celebrating the 900th anniversary of the founding of the order, we did make quite a big deal of it in Wales. And of course, as an academic, I was involved in the more academic side of things, study days, field trips, conferences, museum exhibitions. And after one big planning meeting in the university in Cardiff, we talked about all these things we were going to do. And a colleague of mine said, wouldn't it be fun to organise a pilgrimage that went round all the Cistercian sites in Wales? And then they all looked at me. And I said, fun? That's a completely impractical idea. It must be, oh, at least 500 miles. Actually, it's more like 650. I couldn't possibly think of it. Why are you looking at me? And they said, well, we thought you did that sort of thing. And it was true. I had for many years been leading a pilgrimage group, walking from the Cistercian Abbey at Llantarnam, here in southeast Wales, up to Penrhys in the Rhondda, following the line of a medieval pilgrimage route. So, you know, they pretty much got me bang to rights. So I said it was totally impossible. I couldn't even think of it. And I went home and got the maps out. And over the following, we've been doing this planning a little bit in advance. So I went and did a little bit of exploratory work. And in the summer of 1998, after we'd done the conference and the field study days and all the rest of it, a group of us set out to walk round Wales, visiting and holding events as far as we could in all the Cistercian Abbey sites. And it went, considering how little time we'd had to prepare it, it went surprisingly well. And some of the events were enormous, and we had over 100 people. And some of the events were just me and one other walker sheltering in a thunderstorm and me trying to read a few prayers. But it was quite an experience. I had a very varied group of people walking with me. And at the end of it, I thought, right, well, that's that, you know, end of. I'd taken on a new job, lecturing job, and I was quite busy, but several of the other people who'd walked with me said, you know, that was such an amazing experience. We ought to try to make it into a long distance footpath. Now, the problem is that it's really more than one person can take on as a hobby. And I had taken on this lecturing job and I was quite busy, but various people got involved and they nudged it along. So we have now got, thanks to some funding from the Welsh Government, we've got a website. Here it is, www.cistercianway.wales. We're working on the Welsh version of the website. We're not quite there with that one yet. But the website gives you a basic overview. It takes you down to detailed descriptions of the route between individual abbeys. And it also looks at places of interest on the way. So there's a huge amount of information there. And if you want to know more about the project, there's a limit to how much I can tell you in 3/4 of an hour. Looking at the website is a good place to go. We've also got a blog on which I'm updating bits of the route as I'm able to research them better. I would say we've got probably about 75% of it on reasonably well-maintained footpaths and walkable. and the other 25% is going through areas where the footpaths aren't in good condition. You end up doing a lot of road walking. Now, I know this is something which on the Camino de Santiago is quite familiar, that you can find yourself walking on very, very busy roads with lorries hammering past you, and that this is actually part of the pilgrimage experience. I think it was felt that we couldn't really recommend that for people walking in Wales. So we've been trying to take the route off-road onto footpaths as much as we can. A little bit of background about the Cistercians, I think we need. It was in 1098 that Robert, Abbot of Molesme, which was a great Benedictine abbey in central France, decided that the Benedictine order had moved too far away from its original guiding principles of work and simplicity of life. Things had got too complicated. Things had got too comfortable. He wasn't able to turn around the abbey that he was leading. So in one spring morning in 1098, he and a small group of other monks walked out of the abbey. They went to some land which they'd been given near Dijon in central France, and they established the first Cistercian abbey there. It was hard work, and there were points at which they nearly gave up, but they succeeded in establishing a powerful new religious order which was absolutely dedicated to the idea of simplicity, self-sufficiency. You farmed the land yourself. You did not rely on anybody else for rent, for tithes, for income from courts and mills. If you wanted to eat it, you grew it. If you wanted to wear it, you grew it. So, I mean, in some ways, they were a little bit like the hippies in the 1970s, because it was a lot harder than they realized it was going to be. But it became enormously successful. And from those very small beginnings, the Cistercian Way, the Cistercian order spread all over Europe. It reached Wales fairly quickly. And initially, it was the Anglo-Norman marcher lords who brought the idea of the Cistercian order from France to England and then to Wales. So that in 1131, it was the marcher lord of Chepstow who founded the first Welsh Cistercian abbey at Tintern. Let's have a picture of Tintern in the autumn mist. I mean, lovely place. And at the same time, another order with the same ideas, the Savignac order, which eventually merged with the Cistercian order, was being founded again by Norman marcher lords at places like Neath. Very often, the marcher lords founded Cistercian abbeys on the frontiers of their conquests, knowing that this would protect them, the moral authority of the order would protect them. When the Normans got to West Wales, to places like Whitland, which is usually regarded as the mother house of the Welsh Cistercians, was, like Tintern and Neath, founded by an Anglo-Norman marcher lord. But the area was reconquered by the Welsh. The great Lord Rhys, ruler of Deheubarth, which is southwest Wales, reconquered the area around Whitland. Now, here he had an abbey of French monks. They were the enemy within. He could have kicked them out. Instead, he decided to get them on board. He said they weren't originally at Whitland itself. They were a little bit down the road in a rather smaller, less prepossessing building. And he said to them, "Call this an abbey? Is this how the Normans look after their monks? Oh, I think we can do a bit better than that." He gave them a new site, new buildings, lots more endowment of land. And from that rather strange beginning, the Cistercians spread all over Welsh Wales. They, looking at the map again, Llanseir, Strata Florida, Cymer, Conwy, Ballycrwcis, Strata Marcella, San Sigan, come here, Llantarnam, they're all Welsh foundations. The Cistercians seem to appeal to the Welsh ideals. They in their self-sufficiency and simplicity of life, they reminded us of saints like St. David and the age of the saints. And from being an alien implant, the Cistercians became, well, they went native. They had huge political importance in medieval Wales. It was the Abbot of Santarnam, for example, who backed Owain Glyndŵr in his campaigns in South Wales and actually died on the battlefield at Usk. It was at Strata, Florida, that Llywelyn ap Iorwerth summoned the other rulers of Wales to get them to pledge their allegiance to his son, Dafydd. And it was also at Strata, Florida, that one of our greatest poets, Dafydd ap Gwilym, was buried after a lifetime during which he'd written an awful lot of very naughty verse, including naughty verse about Cistercian nuns. But he still got buried at Strata, Florida, forgiving. And of course, there's the political importance of Cwmhir, where the last Welsh Prince of Wales, well, what was left of the last Welsh Prince of Wales, was buried. This is a modern memorial to him. The Cistercians rewrote the Welsh landscape. They were lucky in that they came to Wales round about the high point of climate improvement before it all got worse in the early 14th century. So if you walk along, for example, this ridge, which is above Margam Abbey in South Wales, you can see these huge square rectangular fields radiating out from the central track. The central track was here first. These are fields which were cleared by the lay brothers of the order. One of the things that the Cistercians dedicated themselves to doing was settling on uncultivated land, bringing it into cultivation. They are credited with establishing the Welsh woolen industry. And of course, it wasn't just medieval. There are also two modern Cistercian communities in Wales, the monks of Caldy Island on the medieval site, and a community of nuns living in Whitland near the ruins of the medieval abbey. So we had a lot to work with. And we also had the fact that most of these abbeys are actually on old trackways. So we were able to use the old trackways between the religious houses. And a lot of them are on pilgrimage sites. Tintern, for example, had a miracle working statue of the Virgin Mary. There were heaps of these all over medieval Europe. And if you look carefully at the string coursing on the side wall here, and you see how there's a bit of a break, whoop, bit of a break in it there. That's probably where the little chapel housing the miracle working statue of the Virgin Mary was constructed so that people could come from outside the abbey and visit it. They could come on pilgrimage. The Cistercians didn't like lay people inside their inner enclosure, but this, to the south wall of the church, was accessible to pilgrims from outside. Strata, Florida, had the Nanteos cup, which claimed, it's one of the many, many cups, which claimed to be the cup which Jesus used at the Last Supper. Valle Crucis had a speaking statue of Christ. These speaking statues seem to have been very popular in the Middle Ages. And at the Reformation, a lot of them were taken down, and it was said that they were deceiving ordinary people. I don't think ordinary people were deceived for a minute. I think these speaking statues were known to be mechanical constructions, but were there to enhance the experience. In the same way that we are not in this, we know we are not in the same room talking to each other, but we can. So they knew this was just a wooden statue. It wasn't Jesus. But at the same time, it developed their experience of worship. Abbey Cwmhir had a miraculous picture, probably a vernicle. Someone had brought it back from a pilgrimage to Rome. Strata Marcella, of which all that is left of Strata Marcella is a few little bumps under the turf just north of Welshpool. Strata Marcella had a fragment of the Holy Cross. Margam looked after the shrine of the Holy Rood of Llangynnoed. This is the parish church of Llangynnoed. There's nothing left now of the rood screen. But all over the hills between Margam and Llangynnoed, which is up near my stag, there are these great hollow ways which mark where pilgrims walked from Margam up to Llangynnoed. And the paths have been worn into the hillside through what AA Roadwatch calls sheer weight of traffic. Give you an idea of scale. These are a couple of 9-year-old girls. This was us when we were walking in 1998. This is my daughter, who's now got children of her own. So there we are, a couple of 9-year-old girls. There's the depth, even nowadays, of the hollow trails that mark this pilgrimage route over the hills from Margam to Llangynoed. And of course, there were holy wells. Penrhys, up in the Rhondda, the famous well at Holywell in Flintshire. Penrhys was a very short-lived Cistercian foundation. Holywell, probably the monks of Basingstoke, settled where they did because they wanted to be near the shrine of St. Winifred. So all these places had things to attract pilgrims. They all had pilgrimage routes going past them. And we were able to use these when we were constructing our Round Wales route. So we were able to go from Llantarnam along the route that pilgrims would have taken up to Penrhys in the Rhondda, over the hill from Penrhys to Llangynoed, and down the route that pilgrims would have taken from Llangynoed to Margam. One of the problems that we had, we wanted to use old pilgrimage routes as far as we could. But of course, so many of them are now under heavy tarmac. Pilgrims going through South Wales to get to St. David's would probably have gone along what is now the A48 and the A40, or even the M4. These do not make for comfortable walking. Similarly, in North Wales, pilgrims going from Holywell out to Aberdaron and Bardsey would have walked along the line of the old Roman road, what was the old A48 before they put the dual carriageway in. Again, not a comfortable walk. So we've had to deal with this challenge of somehow striking a balance between authenticity and walkability. We want people to walk this route as a pilgrimage, but we also want them to walk it as a walk and through walking it to discover the idea of pilgrimage. So we feel we have to make it a walk that is going to attract people in itself. And we also want to treat it as a walk through Welsh history and through the heart of Wales. We found exploring the route, not just things to do with medieval history, but things to do with much wider aspects of Welsh history. When we got west of Neath, for example, on the hills above Pontardawe, there is this wonderful Bronze Age landscape. Kist graves, stone circles, stone alignments, and this takes us back 1,000, 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. So we're going way back into deep history there. When we get a bit further west, between Neath and Tenby, just above St. Clair's, we get to Llanddowror. Now, Llanddowror is famous as the base of Griffith Jones, who established the Sunday school movement in Wales. He saw that people needed to learn, to read the Bible. They couldn't take time off work to do it. Even small children had to be working. So he established Sunday schools. And people learned to read. And then once they'd learned, they taught somebody else. So Griffith Jones Llanddowror is one of the famous Welsh religious leaders of the 18th century. And there is actually a group in the area around Llanddowror that is now trying to establish, I think it's going to be a car-based route, taking you around a lot of the sites that are linked to the story of Griffith Jones. But Llanddowror has an earlier part of the story as well. It's got these two early medieval carved stones. You can see the crosses carved on them in what Sean Rees, formerly of Cadw, describes as a peculiarly Welsh situation. They're just off the touchline of the rugby field. So Llanddowror, again, deep Welsh history and more recent Welsh history. As we take the route north from Cymer, which is on the outskirts of Dolgellau, up past Trawsfynydd and over the hills to Blaen y Ffestiniog. Between Trawsfynydd and Blaen y Ffestiniog is Tommen y Mere. What you can see on this photograph is a Norman motte, a castle mound, but it's set within, you can just see the earthworks. It's set within the boundaries of a Roman fort. And Tommen y Mere is the setting for one of the stories in the 4 branches of the Mabinogion, the story of Mathfab Mathonwy and his daughter Arianrhod and her son, who was born out of wedlock. He brought shame on his mother. She cursed him. She said he would never have a name unless she gave it him, and she would never give him a name, and that he would never have a wife that was born of woman. But his uncle Gwydion was a magician. He tricked Arianrhod into naming the boy Llai Llaw Gyffes, the boy with the cunning hand, and he made Llai a wife out of flowers. And in the end, Mathfab Mathonwy gave them Tommen y Mere. In the story, it's called Mere Castell, as a place to live. But it all fell apart. The wife, who was made out of flowers, her name was Blodeuwr, the flower-faced, she fell in love with someone else. He tried to kill Llai. In the end, Llai killed him. Blodeuwr was turned into an owl and flew away. And that is why the owl in Welsh is called Blodeuwr. And this site here between Trawsfynydd and Blaen y Ffestiniog, it's on the Roman road, and it is the setting for that very strange and tragic story out of Welsh mythology. We've found lots of little Welsh churches. This is a particularly nice one at Llanrhychwyn. Get back to me map again. Llanrhychwyn in the hills above the Conwy Valley. It's a tiny little church. It's one of these little Welsh churches that looks as though it's grown out of the bones of the hills. And it has some really beautiful stained glass. It has this very nice representation of the Trinity, God the Father holding his crucified son in his arms. It's got a very touching fragment of the Virgin and Child, the infant Jesus in his mother's arms. In medieval art, Jesus is very rarely depicted as a vulnerable little baby. People didn't want a baby that they could coo over. They wanted almost a young adult that they could engage with. And so when you look at pictures of the medieval pictures of the Nativity, what you've got in the manger is often sort of shrunk down adult figure. But in this stained glass from Llanrhychwyn, you know, he's got these tiny little vulnerable fingers and toes. It's really rather sweet. And then a couple of saints, St. David and possibly St. Rhychwyn himself. So we found no end of sites which are telling us a lot about Welsh medieval history. But we've not neglected industrial archaeology either. Tintern is in the heart of, actually, beautiful place, Tintern, but it's in a post-industrial landscape when you get to look at it. Meath was one of the biggest ironworks in South Wales in the 18th century. The lead mines in Cwm Ystwyth were hugely important. And here in the Gwydir Forest, which is another area which people think of as an area of enormous natural beauty, there are tens of lead mines. Their buildings are still there in ruins, but you can explore them. So we do feel that it's giving an overview of Welsh history. Now, the project has had its difficulties. As I said at the beginning, I was never intending this to be a permanent long-distance footpath. I got back from walking it in 1998, and I'd just been, well, about halfway round, I was interviewed for the job, and 3/4 of the way round, I discovered I'd actually got it. A lecturing job, full-time, full-on, and all we could really do was sort of pick away at it. We walked it again in 2005, and you know, that put down a bit of a marker, I think. We'd improved bits of the route. There were bits of the route that we explored further in 2005. There were bits that we said, well, this doesn't work, we need to do it differently. Got back from 2005, I'd become head of department, we were having a bit of a crisis, and it all got put on the back burner for a while. And then in 2010, the Welsh coast path was pretty much done and dusted. And people in the Welsh heritage industry and people in the Senedd started looking at other things that we could be doing in the way of long distance footpaths in Wales. And someone actually started asking questions in the Senedd about the Cistercian Way. So Edwina Hart, who was then the Welsh Minister in charge of industry and heritage, got on board with it and was actually enormously helpful. I know some people had issues with Edwina Hart, but we found we got on very well with it. And she gave us a lot of help and advice and a little bit of pump priming funding. And from that, other people got on board with it. I did a bit of filming with the famous Derek the Weatherman, which was enormous fun. If you've ever watched any of the Weatherman walking series, you will know Derek is a character, and he plays on the fact that he's a character. And he does what I call the dumb valley boy act. He pretends to be a bit silly. He's not. He is very, very clever. You're sort of walking along with him and chatting away. And then when you come to do your piece to camera, he's been listening to you. He knows exactly what questions to ask so that you can say what you need to say in about 2 sentences flat. He's very, very good at what he does. So we made a television programme about the route up to Penrhys, just from Pontypridd in the Taff Valley. Various other people took it up at different points in time. When we were thinking about rewalking route in 2005, we were also approached by a youth community leader in Cwmbran in southeast Wales. And she told me that some of her young people, they'd been, I mean, this is amazing. This was a very deprived area. These were kids that you'd normally think of as a bit of a problem. They've been going out, they've been doing some historical field work. They've been identifying some of the pilgrimage routes that we were working on between Santarnam and Penrhys. They had noticed the way in which the walls of some of the paths had been deliberately constructed out of a particular kind of stone, a quartz conglomerate stone that sort of glistens in the sunlight. They'd wanted to find out more about these routes. They'd found our website. And from that, they were inspired to learn a lot more about their area. At round about the same time, I was approached by the famous Iolo Williams, who wanted to make a programme, something about the area. I put Iolo and the young people in touch with each other. They had a half term that I think they'll never forget. I mean, you know, these kids have got their own families now, but they filmed with Iolo along the route. And then, bless their hearts, in June 2005, just before we set off on the walk ourselves, they set off in absolutely vile weather to walk the route between Santarnam and Penrhys, taking their packs with them. And I mean, really, you know, fair play to them. It was quite an astonishing project. And on the back of that, other people in Cwmbran got interested. Cwmbran is one of the new towns of the 1950s, and it thinks it's got no history. And suddenly they realized that the little alleyways that went round behind their houses were actually a medieval pilgrimage route. So on the back of the Young People's Project, that the Ancient Cwmbran Society got going and raised money to do some excavation, for example. They excavated one of these routes that goes up the hill from Cwmbran up over Mynydd Mine, and found that very, very unusual for a medieval road, certainly very unusually for a medieval road in Wales, it was actually surfaced. It was a cobbled road. And the reason why it was a cobbled road was because the sheer numbers of people that were walking it in the Middle Ages, walking from Santarnam up to the shrine in Penrhys. So that was enormously exciting. And then there was the 2012 Cultural Olympiad. I don't know whether, I mean, I'm sure some of you know this chap, Andrew Dugmore. And he was commissioned by the organisers of the Cultural Olympiad which was going to be in 2012, to lead a group on a pilgrimage across South Wales from Llantoni to St David's, from Llandewi Nant Hodni to Tyddewi. And it started out with a huge amount of funding, and the funding went and went and went until eventually we were doing it on scrimps and scripts. And he used a lot of the Cistercian Way across South Wales. And hopefully, if we do get this Camino Cymraeg thing going, we're then going to use part of his route to get us on from Whitland towards St David's. But these photographs, they're from when we got to Caerphilly. And the idea was we were going to arrive at Caerphilly Castle and they wanted to interview us for the news. So we thought, fine, we get to Caerphilly, late afternoon, they can interview us, it can go out on the evening news. No, they wanted to interview us in the middle of the day so that they could edit the film. So in the middle of the day, we were about 5 or 6 miles away. So we had to hijack a minibus from somewhere, get us from where we were down to Caerphilly. And then they wanted us to dress up as fake medieval pilgrims. As though you couldn't be a pilgrim in Gore-Tex and proper boots. You had to dress up in fake brown robes. And then they wanted us to sing. And funny enough, I had actually brought some medieval pilgrim songs. I brought some stuff from the Codex Calixtinus, and I'd also got some stuff from the Red Book of Montserrat, but we hadn't got around to learning them yet. So the only thing we all knew that we could sing was He Who Would Valiant Be. So there we were, 21st century pilgrims, dressed up in fake, I mean, the stuff we're wearing is actually those fleecy things that you get to keep you cozy when you're watching the telly in the evening. And the woman who was organising this had got hold of a whole load of second-hand fleecy robes where to put these on. And they wanted us to take our boots off. At that point, we said no, had enough. So we sang He Who Would Valiant Be. 21st century pilgrims in fake medieval gear, singing an 18th century folk tune to words by a 17th century author collected by a 20th century musician for the English hymnal. And we did this about 10 times while they filmed it from different angles. And then we got bored and we started doing the conga. And the producer, I thought he was going to cry. It was just ridiculous, but we did it. And I suppose, you know, that was what people wanted. I just thought it was rather sad that they couldn't take on board the idea that you could be a modern pilgrim in modern clothes. So that was the Cultural Olympiad. And a lot of individuals have walked the route as well, including quite a lot of people who've said, well, I've done the Camino to Santiago. I was looking for something else. And we were particularly inspired by this chap, Andy Delmage, who is a canon missioner at Birmingham Cathedral. And he's walked practically all of the Cistercian Way. He set out to do the whole thing when he was on sabbatical a few years ago. And he decided he was going to do a bit extra and go to St David's. Now, he's an Anglican clergyman, right? He's supposed to know that this is a work of supererogation, and the 39 articles say you should not do works of supererogation. They're a sign of spiritual pride. But he forgot about that. And he went to St David's, which was a work of supererogation. And on the way back, he did his knee in. He got as far as Whitland. 2 of the nuns who'd been nurses said, you can't walk any farther on that knee, Father Andy, you will go home. And he had to go home. He had to break off his pilgrimage and go home. And he said, actually, for him, the most spiritually important part of the pilgrimage was sitting at home for 2 months with his foot up and an ice pack on it, having to come to terms with the fact that he thought he was so tough and having to come to terms with his own weakness. And he writes a blog called Pilgrim Pace, and he's written quite a bit on that, about being a broken pilgrim. So, where do we go from here? Can we get it back on board? Can we resist the temptation to go further we want to go via Blaen y Ffestiniog up to Frydanog Felen on the Llyn Peninsula, which is where the Cistercians who ended up in Conwy actually started. We've been thinking about trying to break it down into slightly more doable circuits so that, for example, you could do the South Wales and walk across the Monk's Trod, which links Strata Florida and come here, or you could do the North Wales bit and similarly use the Monk's Trod. We've been working on loops and links off the route. You can see quite a lot of them on our website. And we've been working with a lot of local projects, like, for example, the group that's pioneering a route from Llandaff up to Penrhys in the Rhondda. And there is this idea of a Welsh Camino. In 1123, the Pope Calixtus, who did so much to popularize the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, also in 1123 published a papal bull which declared that 2 pilgrimages to St. David's were the equivalent of 1 to Rome. 3 pilgrimages to St. David's were the equivalent of 1 to the Holy Land, which is a pretty good deal if you live in Carmarthenshire already, isn't it? And Pope Calixtus clearly had a vision of Western Christendom pulled together by pilgrimage, which is something I think we could still do with a bit of. So we are, before the pandemic, we were thinking of the possibility of a Camino Cymraeg, a Welsh Camino going across South Wales to St. David's in time for the celebrations in 2023. Now, here we have a possible map. My initial thought was we'd start in Tintern. I mean, you can get to Tintern from various directions using things like the Wye Valley Walk, the Offers Dyke Path. There's going to be, there are apparently plans for something called the St. Augustine's Way, which is going to go from Ost and across the bridge, may eventually get down to Canterbury. Or you could start a little bit further north. You could take a route down from Monmouth. The medieval route from England to St. David's, as far as we can see, crossed the River Wye at Monmouth rather than Chepstow, because the bridge at Chepstow was a bit unreliable. So you'd be going down the borders, following a route that was first mapped in 1675, a man called John Ogilby, who produced the ancestor of the AA Book of the Road and the directions feature on Google Maps. He mapped important routes from London. He mapped routes between important provincial centres like Bristol and Chester. So coming down the Wye Valley, we wouldn't actually walk Ogilby's route as such, because again, it's under tarmac, but we would parallel it on footpaths. And there is some lovely, lovely landscape in the Wye Valley. And there are also some really interesting old churches. This one at Penrhys, you can see it's got late medieval carved bosses. Look, the emblem of St. James. And it's got, it's not nice tombstones. It's got the remains of its churchyard cross. The thing about the church at Penrhys, it just overlooks the Wye Valley. You can see the mist rising up from the river behind it. We don't actually know who the church was dedicated to, but one local tradition is that it was St. James. So Penrhys could have been a staging post on the route downriver, past another church dedicated to St. James at Lancout on the other side of the Wye, to Chepstow, across to Bristol, get on a bigger boat in Bristol, get yourself down to Corunna, you're 9/10 of the way to Compostela. If we go from Monmouth down to Tintern, and then from Tintern through Lower Gwent to Llantarnam, again, you go past lovely old churches, St. Mary's Chapel Hill, which what's there is a Victorian ruin, but the original church was built by the monks for their lay tenants. Penterry, which is perhaps the darker side of the story. Penterry, a church where the little community around it was virtually obliterated by famine and plague in the 14th century. through Chepstow Park Wood and Wentwood. Again, here we're going parallel with Ogilvy's route from London to St David's, which we think is as near as we're going to get to medieval pilgrimage route to St David's. And onwards towards Neath. From Llantarnam, you go over the mountains, hollow ways, little ruined chapel of St Derfel, cross the River Taff. What is now the remains of the Taff Vale Railway Bridge is actually on the site of a medieval wooden bridge that preceded William Edwards's famous stone bridge at Pontypridd. And when Leland came to this area in about 1540, he describes the route to Penrhys village where the pilgrimage was, crossing the river at Pontarhesg by a timber bridge, because he said a stone bridge would be washed away in the spring floods. Something, ironically, this photograph is taken from a bridge that was called the White Bridge, the modern concrete bridge. That has been so badly damaged by the floods in spring of last year that it's currently closed, and we don't know how it's going to be replaced. Go on past the church of Llanwynno, and down the old Llanwynno road, you can see Penrhys in the distance. There's Penrhys, modern statue to the Virgin Mary on the site of a medieval statue, which, according to tradition, appeared by a miracle in an oak tree and could not be taken from the spot. Probably earlier than the statue is the Holy Well. You go over the mountains to Llangynoed and down the hollow ways to Margam. Margam Abbey is absolutely beautiful, the church and the chapter house. And on the hill above Margam Abbey itself, it's Capel Mair, another of these little chapels that was built by the monks for their lay tenants when they were no longer able to recruit lay brothers. They had to start letting their land out to tenants rather reluctantly, didn't want to share their own churches, so they built little outlying chapels for them. Capel Mair, after the dissolution of the monasteries, became a focal point for clandestine Catholic worship. There are a lot of stories about Catholic religious services being held there at a time when you could be killed for doing that. So we go past Capel Mair, and from that point, really the easiest way of getting round to Neath is on the coast path. It's a surprisingly pleasant walk. If you look at it on the map, you think you're about 10 feet above the motorway and it's going to be murder. In actual fact, you're more like 50 or 60 feet above the motorway. And you're up in this little world of your own. And, you know, you're sort of walking through the bracken and the brambles and thinking clear thoughts. And 50 yards below you, people are whizzing around and getting stressed. And you're not part of that. You're part of something totally different. After Neath, it does get a bit tricky, but we've worked out a good route that goes over the hills to Pontydilais, down the Gwendryth Valley to Ferryside. There's a hint in the name Ferryside. There was a ferry there in the Middle Ages. There was a ferry there again, a re-established ferry, the Carmarthen Bay ferry, but the pandemic has, well, it's suspended. And we really are hoping that it will revive, because it does make getting a route across South Wales to St David's and getting the Cistercian Way across South Wales considerably easier. We're on from Ferryside. It seems we are on the medieval pilgrimage route. The two little churches of Llandilo Abercowen and Llanbehangel Abercowen, either side of the Cowen estuary, just south of St Clair's, are churches which seem to have been extended to cater for the needs of pilgrims. Once you get to St Clair's, the Cistercian Way goes south towards Tenby to take in the modern Cistercian community on Caldy Island. But I think a Camino Cymraeg would probably go pretty much due west, go to Llanddowror, and then there are quite good trackways through the forest from Llanddowror to Whitland, where you've got not just the site of the Abbey, but also the Hywel Dda Centre, which commemorates and explains the great law book, which is attributed to Hywel Dda, an early king of Wales, which tells you, among other things, 3 things if you pick them up on the road, you can keep them. A horseshoe, a nail, and a penny. Things worth knowing if you're a pilgrim. From Whitland, we've had several alternative routes suggested. There is the route that Andrew Dugmore took when he was doing the Cultural Olympiad. Before the pandemic, we were working with the Ramblers in Southwest Wales on possible alternative routes. I think we'd probably make for the coast path roundabout Solva, because that would enable us to go to St Non's Chapel and from there to St David's. So there is this possibility of a Camino Cymraeg, quite a challenging walk across South Wales to St David's. And I know that Caroline Evans, the St David's Diocesan Faith Tourism Officer, is listening out there. And Caroline really would be the person who'd have to be in the driving seat if we were going to develop this idea any further. There is another possible alternative for a Camino Cymraeg, a Camino Galés, which the Confraternity of St James might like to think about. An organisation called Journeyings, which I know some of you will have heard of. They lead pilgrimage walks of all sorts of lengths. I mean, afternoon walks up to several days. And before the pandemic, they had started leading groups walking the last 100 kilometres along the coast path, north and south of St David's. So you do the 100 kilometres, which I think is the minimum you can do to get to Compostela. Yeah. And you do the 100 kilometres, you end up in St David's. There is a reception at St David's. You get a certificate, which is along, it's the same idea as the Compostela. And that was quite successful before the pandemic. So that again, I think, could function as a Camino Cymraeg that the confraternity might like to take on board. Right, well, I think I've probably talked for long enough.